chess friends, hope you are doing well. Today I have a very interesting and cunning chess game that was played between AlphaZero and me. AlphaZero, of course, is one of the most terrifying creations of modern artificial intelligence, a silicon philosopher that plays chess the way Einstein bent spacetime, effortlessly and with frightening elegance, and its performance rating floats somewhere beyond 4000 Elo, where human grandmasters start questioning their life choices. This game is incredible because I illustrated several chess tactics that can help boost your chess abilities and talents, so let's get started without wasting any time. I started the game with pawn to c4, the English opening, a move that quietly grabs face like a British Empire expansion, slow, calm, and suddenly half the board belongs to you. Last time we saw pawn to c5 from black, but AlphaZero decided to go with knight goes to f6, immediately controlling the d5 square like a security guard guarding the entrance to a royal palace. Therefore I played knight goes to c3, adding more pressure to the center, because when humans see a square like d5 we get obsessed with it the way physicists obsess over black holes. AlphaZero replied with pawn goes to e6, reinforcing control over d5 and calmly preparing its structure, the kind of positional discipline that would make Sun Tzu proud. That's why I played pawn goes to e4, claiming more central space and preparing the d5 outpost for my knight, because in chess if you control the center you control the universe. Newton controlled gravity, and I control the d5 square. After a couple of moves AlphaZero pushed pawn to e5, a slightly impatient break clearly aimed at occupying the d4 square before my knight plants itself on d5 like a stubborn philosopher refusing to leave the stage. Now the board turns into a race, almost like a rat race in a laboratory where both bishops are sprinting toward the g5 and g4 squares to see which one reaches the cheese first, except here the cheese is tactical domination and the rats are highly trained chess engines. After a few more moves when my rook goes to b1, it becomes clear that I plan to push my queenside pawns forward to b4 and c5, expanding like a slow-moving glacier crushing everything in its path. AlphaZero responded with knight goes to g4, a very romantic move, yes romantic, because knights jumping toward kingside attacks often lead to tragic love stories involving sacrifices and broken kings. But I calmly castled kingside, bringing my king to safety, because even in the chaos of chess the king prefers a quiet castle rather than living like Hamlet in existential crisis. In this position AlphaZero ignored normal human moves like pawn to d6, pawn to a5, or even castling. No, AlphaZero decided to play pawn goes to h5, lighting the board like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. Playing a normal move here such as pawn to d3 would lead you into a very dangerous situation, the kind of situation where beginners start sweating and engines start smiling. For example, if pawn goes to d3 then pawn to a5 will follow, destabilizing the queenside, and after a few precise moves a knight lands on d4 and suddenly the position begins collapsing like a poorly designed bridge. Once the knight exchanges occur, if white plays something innocent like pawn goes to a3, one of those moves you see in 2000 rated games where everyone thinks they are safe, then black can swing the queen to h4. The queen arrives like a shark in the deep blue ocean searching for treasure around your king's island. After pawn goes to h3, the pawn gets captured and suddenly your king is in a very uncomfortable situation, the kind of situation where even Shakespeare would say this king is not having a good day. As the king moves, rook goes to a6 appears with the dangerous idea of rook going to g6, and now the attack is roaring like a Tesla engine at full acceleration. The position becomes nearly lost because knight goes to g4 check appears, the pawn in front of your king is pinned like a butterfly in a museum display, and with the extra support of the bishop the king becomes extremely vulnerable. At that moment, like square bishop can even sacrifice itself on h3, a brutal tactical explosion that tears open the king's shelter like a meteor crashing into earth, and suddenly the position collapses for white. In chess, just like in physics, one small imbalance can trigger a chain reaction, and AlphaZero was trying to ignite exactly that kind of explosion. But in our actual game, instead of playing any normal move, I played pawn goes to h3, directly challenging the knight and basically asking AlphaZero the ancient human question: are you brave or just pretending to be brave? AlphaZero of course accepted the challenge because chess engines do not believe in fear, they believe in calculation measured in millions of positions per second. But the problem for you is that after you capture the knight and after the recapture, the file becomes wide open, and in chess an open file is like opening the gates of Troy. Something dangerous is about to walk in. Suddenly queen goes to h4 becomes possible, sliding into the attack like a submarine quietly approaching enemy waters. The best move for you is pawn goes to g3, trying to patch the holes around your king like a nervous engineer fixing cracks in a dam. After the exchanges occur, queen goes to f6 arrives with the idea of queen going to h6, and now the queen is eyeing the file like a hawk looking for dinner. As the rook moves, bishop goes to g4 follows, placing pressure on the bishop on f3, and suddenly the position becomes uncomfortable. You cannot capture the light square bishop because your pawn on f2 is attacked by two pieces and the file is completely seized, which in chess is basically the equivalent of losing air superiority in war. Therefore you are forced to block the attack by playing rook goes to e3, but congratulations, you just lost the rook, and the position collapses faster than a poorly written philosophy thesis. Going back to the real position, I did not capture the knight because doing so would be like swimming in a river full of crocodiles while holding a stake in your hand. Instead I played pawn goes to d3, calmly reinforcing the center, and after a couple of moves we see pawn goes to a3 to prevent any annoying counterplay. As the knight retreats we have bishop goes to g5, pinning the knight like a scientist pinning an insect specimen under a microscope, and now knight goes to d5 is lurking, which could ruin the knight and its entire career. AlphaZero simply played queen goes to d7, looking very casual, as if it were drinking tea while preparing a tactical storm. And one might ask, AlphaZero, aren't you afraid of losing the knight on f6? Because after the exchanges the g file opens for the rook and bishop takes h3 could destroy my king's position. That kind of moment is like arguing with someone and only realizing the perfect comeback 2 hours later when you're already home. It hurts, but it's too late. However, in the real game, instead of capturing the knight I moved bishop goes to e3, calmly retreating. After that AlphaZero played bishop takes e3, a sharp exchange. My queen could capture the bishop, but I refused, because sometimes grabbing material is like eating junk food, it feels good but ruins your long-term health. Instead I played pawn takes e3, protecting the central squares and opening the f-file, which means my rook is now breathing fresh oxygen. Additionally I am threatening pawn goes to d4, and my queen can also swing to f2 and then to h4 if necessary, like a queen planning a royal tour of destruction. After a couple more moves pawn goes to d4 appears, followed by knight goes to g5 attacking the bishop and creating more pressure. After a few additional maneuvers we see queen goes to d1, increasing pressure on the pawn structure, which forced AlphaZero to push a pawn forward. And now comes knight goes to d5, a very powerful and energetic move. The knight drinks pure glucose and immediately attacks the opposing knight like a caffeinated gladiator entering the arena. The point is simple: if you capture this knight with your knight, I will recapture instantly, forcing the bishop to retreat, and then the bishop slides towards c4 where the real trouble begins. The point is very clear that my queen wants to go to h5, dominating the file and slowly turning the enemy king's house into a haunted building. Once the queen lands there the entire king side starts shaking like a badly designed bridge in an earthquake. Therefore if you even dare to play pawn goes to f6 to kick out my knight simply jumps to e6 supported by the bishop, and suddenly the position looks like a nuclear experiment gone wrong. That is my atomic plan, an atom bomb plan, to destroy your king, the center, and basically the entire civilization of your position. Now going back to the position, we discovered that capturing the knight is actually a terrible decision. the kind of move that makes engines laugh the way Einstein would laugh if someone tried to prove gravity wrong. So instead we have bishop takes knight, and after the pawn captures, rook goes to f5 appears on the board like a firefighter rushing into a burning building. My idea is very simple: double the rooks and increase pressure. That is why the knight retreats, and after a couple of moves the bishop slides to c4 while the queen goes to e2. Soon we see knight exchanges and rook goes to f1, successfully doubling the rooks, which in chess is basically like assembling two cannons aimed at the same castle wall. So far everything looks excellent. A few moves later both sides start maneuvering pieces back and forth like dancers after finishing work on a Friday evening, pieces gliding across the board like people dancing in a nightclub while the DJ plays tactical music. But suddenly the mood changes. As soon as the rook arrives on g5 and another rook swings to h5, controlling the diagonal and file, the king starts feeling extremely uncomfortable, like a celebrity surrounded by paparazzi with no exit door. Another rook joins the party, and after a few more moves you can clearly see that both sides are maneuvering carefully, each waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally I played pawn goes to g3, breaking the position open. Whether you capture the pawn or not doesn't really matter, because AlphaZero immediately begins its counterattack by capturing the pawn on d4. After I recapture, AlphaZero plays pawn goes to c5, a very powerful and precise move. This is the kind of move that looks quiet but secretly contains the spirit of Sun Tzu's Art of War. The idea is simple: if you capture the pawn with your pawn from d4, the rook will capture back and suddenly the c-file becomes wide open, giving black complete control over the queenside like a navy controlling the ocean. Going back to the position, if you try some passive move instead, hoping the storm will pass, it brings no advantage because the rook on a5 will soon activate, and the pressure will only increase. Seeing the danger of the c5 pawn, I decided to solve the problem directly by playing pawn goes to e5, a very glorious move that attacks the pawn on f6 while simultaneously being attacked by the pawn on d6. It's the kind of bold move that makes chess beautiful, two forces colliding like particles inside the Large Hadron Collider. AlphaZero responds by first capturing the pawn on g3 with check, forcing the king to react. And here comes the critical moment: if you casually capture the e-pawn with your pawn from d6, the position collapses for you immediately. One small mistake and the entire structure falls apart, like a tower of cards collapsing under the laws of physics that even Newton himself could not save you from. I can break your ego and smash your rook by playing pawn goes to d6, forcing the rook to move because the pawn is marching forward like Napoleon crossing Europe with unstoppable ambition. Once the rook moves, bishop goes to c4, check appears on the board, forcing the king to move, and then pawn takes e5 will write a glorious history in golden letters about how I conquered your position. The pawn on f6 becomes poisoned, the kind of pawn that looks tasty but actually ends careers. Even the queen cannot capture the pawn on e5 safely, and knight takes e5 would immediately lose the position because after the exchanges and queen takes e5 the pawn becomes pinned and suddenly the entire game falls into my hands like gravity pulling everything downward. Newton would approve. Going back to the position, we realize that pawn takes e5 is a terrible choice, a poisoned move that looks logical but hides a tactical disaster. Therefore we see pawn takes e5 instead, and rook goes to g5 appears on the board, putting pressure along the diagonal like a laser beam targeting weak squares. Bishop goes to e2 follows in the game. Now the knight is under attack, but AlphaZero simply ignores it because there is no better option. Sometimes even the strongest engines must accept unpleasant realities, just like philosophers accepting that the universe does not care about their feelings. Then rook goes to g2 arrives on the board, crashing into the position and completely crippling the attack. AlphaZero begins to collapse under the pressure, and after a couple of moves when pawn goes to d3 appears and my queen moves to d6, the point becomes crystal clear. If you dare to capture my bishop, the position is completely over for you, because after a check and the capture on queen goes to d8, I capture the queen and later I can even collect the rook, putting me into a completely winning position. Going back again to the position, we understand that pawn takes bishop simply does not matter, because after the queen retreats and a few more precise moves, the position becomes totally winning for me. I deliver a check on d8 and capture the rook with pawn goes to d6, and now the queen is under attack. No matter where the queen goes to h5 leads directly to a devastating checkmating attack, turning the king's shelter into a collapsing fortress. After the final exchanges and recaptures, at the end of the day you can clearly see that my king and queen worked together like a perfectly coordinated scientific experiment, Einstein handling the theory and Tesla handling the electricity, and the result was inevitable. I finished the game by delivering checkmate with my queen and king. Take care, keep calculating like a supercomputer, and I will see you very soon in the next chess adventure.